Every man carries a shadow. Some deny it, some suppress it. But none escape it. Picture this. A man walks through life wearing the mask of virtue. He volunteers at charities, speaks of compassion, and judges others for their moral failings. Yet in the quiet moments when no one is watching, something else stirs within him. A whisper of envy when his colleague gets promoted. A flash of hatred when his neighbor succeeds. A secret satisfaction when someone he dislikes fails. This man is not evil. He is human. And he is you, he is me. He is all of us. We live in a world that demands we present only our best selves. Hide your anger. It's unprofessional. Suppress your jealousy. It's ugly. Deny your lust. It's immoral. But here lies the trap that Carl Jung warned us about over a century ago. The darkness we refuse to acknowledge doesn't simply vanish into thin air. It grows stronger in the shadows, feeding on our denial, controlling us from beneath the surface of our consciousness. Every act of road rage, every bitter comment disguised as concern, every moment when we find ourselves inexplicably hostile towards someone who reminds us of something we hate about ourselves, these are not random occurrences. They are the shadow speaking. What if I told you that the greatest enemy you will ever face is not the person who betrays you, not the system that oppresses you, not even the circumstances that defeat you? What if the most dangerous adversary is the one you've spent your entire life running from? The dark aspects of yourself that you've buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. Tonight, we're going to do something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We're going to turn around and face what's been following us in the dark. In 1913, a brilliant Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung made a decision that would forever change how we understand the human psyche. He broke away from his mentor, Sigmund Freud, and embarked on a journey into the deepest recesses of human consciousness. A journey that nearly destroyed him and ultimately revealed one of psychology's most profound truths. While Freud focused on sexual desire as the driving force behind human behavior, Jung saw something far more complex and terrifying. He recognized that human beings systematically repress not just their sexual impulses, but entire aspects of their personality that society deems unacceptable. Aggression becomes buried beneath politeness. Selfishness hides behind altruism. Cruelty masks itself as justice. Jung called this hidden aspect of personality the shadow, and he discovered it not through academic study, but through a terrifying confrontation with his own darkness. During what historians now call his Red Book period, Jung deliberately descended into his unconscious mind, allowing himself to experience visions, fantasies, and impulses that most people would consider madness. He spoke with inner figures, battled psychological demons, and came face to face with aspects of himself that horrified him. For years, he teetered on the edge of what others might call insanity, but Jung emerged from this psychological underworld with a revolutionary insight. The shadow is not pure evil to be eliminated. It is raw, untamed energy that contains both destructive and creative potential. Like uranium, it can power cities or level them, depending on how it's handled. Jung realized that every person develops a persona, a social mask we wear to fit into society. The brighter and more perfect this persona becomes, the darker and more powerful the shadow grows in compensation. The saint carries within him the potential for great cruelty. The philanthropist harbors deep selfishness. The peacemaker conceals violent impulses. Most crucially, Jung discovered that the shadow operates not just in individuals, but in entire cultures and nations. When societies collectively deny their darkness, projecting it onto enemies and outsiders, the results can be catastrophic. The shadow doesn't disappear through denial. It accumulates like pressure in a volcano, until it erupts with devastating force. This was not merely a psychological theory for Jung. As he watched Europe tear itself apart in 2 world wars, he saw the collective shadow of Western civilization unleashed in ways that defied rational explanation. How else could cultured, educated societies commit such systematic atrocities? The shadow, Jung concluded, is the price we pay for consciousness itself. To be civilized, we must repress certain impulses. But what we repress does not die, it waits watching, growing stronger in the darkness of our denial. Here's the terrifying truth about psychological repression. What you deny in yourself, you will see everywhere else. Jung discovered a mechanism that operates with mathematical precision in the human psyche. When we refuse to acknowledge our own anger, we become hypersensitive to anger in others. When we suppress our envy, we develop an uncanny ability to detect envy in everyone around us. When we deny our capacity for deception, we become paranoid about being deceived. This is projection, the shadow's favorite weapon. And it doesn't just distort our perception, it controls our behavior in ways we never suspect. Consider the morally outraged preacher who rails against sexual impropriety while secretly harboring the very desires he condemns. His public righteousness isn't hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It's a desperate attempt to suppress what he cannot face in himself. The more he denies his own sexuality, the more obsessed he becomes with controlling it in others. He is not lying about his moral convictions. He genuinely believes in them. But his shadow is running the show. Or examine the friend who always seems so understanding, so supportive, so selflessly kind. Yet somehow subtly, they manage to undermine your confidence. They remember every failure you've shared. They offer help in ways that highlight your inadequacies. They express concern that feels more like judgment. This person isn't consciously malicious. They've simply buried their competitive and aggressive impulses so deeply that these impulses have learned to operate through their kindness, Jung observed that the brighter the persona, the more perfect our public image, the darker the shadow becomes. The person who never shows anger accumulates years of suppressed rage. The individual who prides themselves on never being selfish develops a hidden sense of entitlement that eventually explodes in spectacular ways. This creates a psychological slavery that most people never recognize. They believe they're in control of their actions, making conscious choices based on their values. In reality, they're being puppeteered by the very impulses they've refused to acknowledge. The suppressed shadow doesn't obey conscious will. It has its own agenda, its own timeline, its own methods of expression. Watch how this plays out in relationships. The person who denies their need for control becomes passive-aggressive, manipulating through guilt and victimhood. The individual who suppresses their anger becomes chronically depressed, turning their rage inward. The one who refuses to acknowledge their selfishness becomes a martyr, using their sacrifice as a weapon to control others. Perhaps most insidiously, shadow projection creates enemies where none exist. When we cannot tolerate certain qualities in ourselves, we unconsciously seek them out in others to attack. The war against external enemies becomes a way of fighting the internal enemy we cannot face. This is why the most vicious criticism often comes from those who possess the very traits they condemn. The shadow makes us slaves to our own denial. Until we turn around to face what we've been running from, we remain trapped in patterns we cannot understand, fighting battles we cannot win, controlled by forces we refuse to acknowledge exist. If the individual shadow is dangerous, the collective shadow is apocalyptic. Jung lived through both world wars, watching in horror as entire nations succumbed to mass psychological projections that defied rational explanation. How could Germany, the land of Goethe and Beethoven, of philosophy and science, transform into a machinery of systematic genocide? How could civilized people become willing participants in unspeakable atrocities? The answer lay in the collective shadow, the accumulated darkness that societies refuse to acknowledge about themselves. Nazi Germany did not emerge from pure evil or even primarily from economic desperation. It arose from a collective psychological mechanism that Jung recognized with chilling clarity. A nation that prided itself on cultural superiority and moral righteousness projected all of its unacceptable qualities onto designated scapegoats. Jews became the repository for German greed, weakness, and moral corruption. Communists embodied the chaos and disorder that Germans feared in themselves. The disabled and mentally ill represented the genetic imperfection that contradicted myths of racial purity. This projection served a psychological function. It allowed ordinary Germans to see themselves as purely good while channeling their collective shadow through sanctioned violence against the other. The more heinous the crimes committed against these projected enemies, the more righteous the perpetrators felt. They were not committing evil. They were cleansing the world of it. But Germany was not unique. The same mechanism operated during the Cold War, when both superpowers projected their fears and aggressive impulses onto each other. Americans saw in the Soviet Union everything they feared about collectivism: and the loss of individual freedom. Soviets saw in America the embodiment of exploitation and inequality that they couldn't acknowledge in their own system. Both sides are prepared to destroy the world rather than face what they feared most about themselves. Consider how this pattern repeats throughout history. Colonial powers convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to savage peoples, while projecting their own capacity for violence and exploitation onto those they conquered. Inquisitors tortured confessions from heretics while believing they were saving souls, projecting their own spiritual doubts onto their victims. Revolutionaries committed mass murder while convinced they were eliminating oppression, unable to see the tyrannical impulses they carried within themselves. The collective shadow operates through what Jung called psychological epidemics, mass movements where rational individuals become possessed by archetypal forces they cannot recognize or control. These epidemics always follow the same pattern. A group identifies itself with absolute good and projects absolute evil onto an enemy. The enemy must be destroyed not for practical reasons, but for psychological ones, to maintain the group's illusion of purity. What makes collective shadow projection so dangerous is its moral certainty. Those possessed by it do not see themselves as perpetrators, but as heroes fighting against evil. They commit their worst atrocities with clear consciences, convinced they are serving the highest good. History's greatest monsters were rarely motivated by simple malice. They were driven by the need to destroy what they could not acknowledge in themselves. In our interconnected world, where information travels instantly and tribal identities transcend geographic boundaries, the potential for collective shadow projections has only increased. Social media amplifies our tendency to demonize those who disagree with us. Political movements increasingly define themselves not by what they support, but by what they oppose. Nations build their identity around shared enemies rather than shared values. Jung's warning echoes across the decades. When societies refuse to acknowledge their darkness, that darkness will find expression through violence, oppression, and war. The collective shadow demands sacrifice, and it will have it, either through conscious integration or unconscious destruction. We live in an age of unprecedented transparency, where every moment can be documented, shared, and scrutinized. Yet paradoxically, this has created the most sophisticated system of shadow projection in human history. Social media has transformed the ancient human tendency toward projection into a global phenomenon operating at the speed of light. Instagram and Facebook have become elaborate persona factories, where millions craft perfect versions of themselves, while their shadows leak through in comment sections, private messages, and the compulsive need for validation from strangers. Watch the psychology unfold. The person who curates an image of perfect happiness becomes obsessed with exposing the flaws and failures of others. The individual who presents themselves as morally superior spends hours searching for evidence of hypocrisy in their enemies. The one who broadcasts their success becomes secretly tormented by others' achievements. Modern outrage culture is shadow projection disguised as moral righteousness. People who cannot tolerate their own capacity for prejudice, cruelty, or selfishness hunt relentlessly for these qualities in others. The mob that destroys someone's career over a decades-old tweet is not motivated by justice. It's driven by the unconscious need to punish in others what they cannot face in themselves. Consider how consumer culture exploits our shadows. Advertising doesn't sell products. It sells the promise of eliminating unwanted aspects of ourselves. Buy this car to suppress your feelings of inadequacy. Use this product to hide your aging. Wear these clothes to mask your insecurities. The entire economy depends on people remaining unconscious of what drives their behavior. Corporate and political institutions have learned to weaponize shadow projection with scientific precision. They don't need to convince people their policies are good. They just need to convince people their enemies are evil. Politicians build careers not on their own merits, but on their ability to embody their voters' projections about who is to blame for their problems. The 24-hour news cycle has become a shadow projection machine, feeding our addiction to moral superiority by providing an endless stream of villains to hate and heroes to worship. We consume outrage like a drug, each story reinforcing our illusion that evil exists only out there in those who disagree with us. Even our entertainment reflects this psychological dynamic. Reality TV thrives on shadow projection, allowing viewers to judge and mock participants while feeling superior to them. Crime dramas provide safe ways to experience violence and cruelty through identification with heroic protagonists, fighting absolute evil. We've created an entire industry devoted to feeding our shadows while maintaining our conscious sense of righteousness. Perhaps most disturbing is how technology amplifies our capacity for shadow projection while making us less aware of it. Algorithms curate our information diet to confirm our biases, creating echo chambers where we only encounter evidence that supports our projections. We become convinced that our enemies are more evil and numerous than they actually are, while our own side appears more virtuous and victimized. The result is a world where billions of people walk around carrying sophisticated projection systems in their pockets, constantly feeding their shadows while believing they're staying informed and connected. We've created the most divided societies in human history, not despite our communication technology, but because of how it interacts with our unconscious psychology. Jung predicted this perfectly. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. In the digital age, anything includes constructing elaborate virtual realities that protect us from self-knowledge while giving us unlimited opportunities to project our darkness onto others. The modern world hasn't eliminated the shadow. It has given it more sophisticated disguises and more powerful amplification systems than ever. Before the journey towards psychological wholeness begins with the most terrifying step imaginable, turning around to face what you've spent your life running from. Jung called this process individuation, becoming whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, including those you find most reprehensible. This is not about indulging your darkness or giving free rein to destructive impulses. It's about developing a conscious relationship with forces that will otherwise control you. Unconsciously, the process begins with radical honesty about your own capacity for the very things you condemn in others. Can you admit that you're capable of cruelty? Do you harbor envy toward those who have what you want? Do you sometimes wish harm on people who stand in your way? Do you take secret pleasure in others' failures? This admission is not moral weakness. It's the foundation of genuine strength. The person who can acknowledge their capacity for violence is less dangerous than the one who believes they're incapable of it. The individual who recognizes their selfishness can make conscious choices about when to serve their own interests versus others. The one who admits their prejudices can work to counteract them. Jung used a powerful metaphor. Fighting the shadow is like wrestling in the dark, where you can never be sure who is winning. Integration is like turning on the light. Suddenly you can see clearly, and the struggle transforms from blind conflict into conscious choice. The practical work of shadow integration involves several dangerous but necessary steps. First, pay attention to your projections. What qualities do you find most repulsive in others? What types of people trigger immediate dislike or disgust? These reactions are gifts. They're showing you aspects of yourself you've disowned. Second, examine your moral certainty. When you find yourself absolutely convinced that you're right and others are wrong, ask yourself what you might be avoiding in your own position. The shadow often hides behind righteousness, using moral superiority to avoid self-examination. Third, explore your family history and cultural conditioning. What traits were forbidden in your upbringing? What aspects of human nature did your culture teach you to despise? These rejected qualities didn't disappear, they went underground, where they continue to influence your behavior without your awareness. Fourth, practice what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the aspects of yourself you've rejected. This might involve journaling from the perspective of your shadow, imagining conversations with internal figures who represent your disowned qualities, or simply paying attention to thoughts and impulses you normally suppress. The goal is not to eliminate the shadow, but to develop a conscious relationship with it. Your capacity for anger, properly integrated, becomes the ability to set boundaries and fight for what matters. Your selfishness, consciously owned, becomes healthy self-care and the ability to pursue your authentic goals. Your capacity for deception becomes strategic thinking and the ability to protect yourself when necessary. Perhaps most importantly, shadow work transforms your relationship with others. When you stop projecting your disowned qualities onto other people, you can see them more clearly. Your enemies become human beings with understandable motivations. Your heroes become flawed individuals doing their best with limited resources. This doesn't lead to moral relativism. It leads to moral clarity based on reality rather than projection. The integrated person becomes paradoxically both more humble and more powerful. Humble, because they recognize their own capacity for the full range of human behavior. Powerful, because they're no longer controlled by unconscious forces or driven to fight external enemies who represent internal conflicts. This is the path Jung described as moving from being lived by unconscious forces to living consciously. It's the difference between being a puppet of your own repressed psychology and becoming the author of your own authentic existence. We return to where we began. Every man carries a shadow. Every woman harbors darkness. Every society accumulates collective unconscious material that demands expression. The question that will determine the trajectory of your life, your relationships, and perhaps even the fate of our civilization is simple. Will you remain a slave to this darkness, or will you become its master? Most people choose slavery without realizing it. They spend their lives running from aspects of themselves they cannot face, projecting their disowned qualities onto others, fighting external battles that represent internal conflicts they refuse to acknowledge. They remain convinced they are good people surrounded by evil, rational individuals trapped in an irrational world, victims of forces beyond their control. This is the path of unconsciousness, and it leads inevitably to suffering, both personal and collective. The unlived life expresses itself through symptoms: depression, anxiety, rage, addiction, destructive relationships, meaningless conflicts, and the endless search for enemies to blame for internal emptiness. But there is another path, the path of consciousness that Jung called individuation. This journey requires facing what you've spent your life avoiding, owning what you've projected onto others, and developing a relationship with the darkness you carry within you. Those who take this path discover something remarkable. The shadow that seems so terrifying from a distance often contains the very qualities they need to live authentically. The anger they've suppressed carries their passion. The selfishness they've denied contains their genuine desires. The cruelty they've projected holds their capacity for necessary boundaries. When you stop being afraid of your own darkness, you stop being controlled by it. When you cease projecting your unconscious material onto others, you can see reality clearly. When you integrate your shadow, you become whole, not perfect but complete. This transformation is not comfortable. It requires dismantling the carefully constructed persona you've used to navigate the world. It means giving up the moral superiority that comes from seeing yourself as purely good and others as carriers of evil. It demands accepting responsibility for thoughts, feelings, and impulses you'd prefer to deny. But the alternative is remaining trapped in psychological patterns that will repeat endlessly until they are made conscious. The shadow that is not integrated will express itself through projection, symptoms, and unconscious behavior that ultimately causes more suffering than the initial discomfort of facing it directly. We stand at a crossroads as a species. Our technology has given us unprecedented power to amplify our collective shadows through global communication networks, mass media, and weapons of unimaginable destruction. We can continue projecting our darkness onto designated enemies, building walls between us and them, and preparing for conflicts that represent nothing more than humanity fighting with itself. Or we can take Jung's path, the path of consciousness, integration, and psychological maturity. We can learn to recognize projection when it arises, to question our moral certainties, to face the aspects of ourselves and our cultures that we've disowned. The choice is yours. You can spend your life being lived by unconscious forces, controlled by the very darkness you refuse to acknowledge, remaining a slave to shadows you project onto the world around you. Or you can turn around, face what you've been running from, and discover that your greatest weakness may become your hidden strength. Until you understand your darkness, you will never control it. But once you do, you may find it was never your enemy. It was the missing piece of yourself waiting in the shadows to make you whole. The shadow you fear is the shadow you feed. The darkness you deny is the darkness that controls you, but the shadow you face, understand and integrate becomes the foundation of authentic power, genuine compassion, and psychological freedom. The choice, as always, is yours. This complete script maintains the cinematic, thought-provoking tone you requested, while hitting the exact word count targets for each section. Here it flows seamlessly from one section to the next, building psychological tension while providing deep insights into Jung's shadow concept and its relevance to both personal development and societal issues.